So my favourite kind of robot story is where writers and actors try to get inside the head of a robot character or an AI. This is what I've tried to do in Nova Sapiens: The Believers, but I really love it when other writers and directors do this as well, of course.
Hi, I'm Dave Cooper. I teach software engineering at university, and I write science fiction about robots. Here, I'm comparing some of the weird things that robots and AIs get up to in sci-fi to what we might extrapolate from computer science and society. When you get a chance, check out Nova Sapiens: The Believers.
There's three books that I've read in recent times that I thought do this really well. There's the Murderbot series by Martha Wells. There's A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers that I've just finished listening to the audiobook of, and that's brilliant. There's also Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill, and that one's also quite unique in being the only post-apocalyptic story I've read, but it does this getting inside the head of a robot character as well. It can be a bit frustrating when the storyteller gives you this amazing robot character and doesn't try to get inside their head. That's kind of a frustrating situation. There's certain movies out there and stories where the whole story is told from a human's point of view, and you're presented with this robot character, but you can never really see into their head. You can never really get a sense of what they're actually thinking. And the whole story, the suspense of the story is built around, is this a real person or not? And I'd like actually to move on from there to some extent. I mean, I know in computer science this is definitely not a solved problem, don't get me wrong. But if we can, for the sake of the argument, say, what if we have a robot or an AI that is genuinely human-like and isn't what we call an artificial general intelligence, so that it, or they, more precisely, can solve potentially any problem just as we can solve them. What if we have this character where the reader or the viewer and the storyteller agree that they are a person? Possibly other people in the story don't necessarily agree with that. That could be the point of the story. There's wider society to consider. There's lots of people out there who we imagine probably don't agree that this entity is a real person, and that can drive the story. But say we believe it, say the reader and the writer believes it. How do we get inside the head of that character? Because to me, that's one of the most fascinating parts of robot science fiction. It's trying to understand what it would be like to be a robot or an AI.
As long as one is in the shop, can you do work on one's face? One wishes to have more expression. One has thoughts and feelings that presently do not show.
You want your thoughts and feelings to show on your face?
Yes, like the contempt that you are showing me right now.
What happens if we do this badly is that we get this robot character and they might present as a kind of generic person, and they might know all sorts of facts about themselves, but they won't come across as a person who has actually lived through the experience of being a robot in a society. And that's kind of irritating, right? You'd expect that if you're writing this character who is a robot, they wouldn't just be a generic person. They would be a person who has had lived experience with all of the things that might go wrong with their body, and all of the things that they're afraid that other people might say to them or do to them. All of the rights they might be denied, for instance. There would be that sense of their own status in their mind. They believe they're a person, we believe they're a person, the characters in the story might not, but they're still a fairly unique kind of person. They would be shaped by their experience. They're not just there. So in order to write a character like this, you have to make a few decisions about the nature of the technology, of course. A lot of stories, to my great frustration, start off with some kind of mad scientist basically just pressing an on switch, and the robot or the AI just comes to life. And they're a fully formed person somehow in that instant. They might be very, very naive about the world, they have a lot of questions, but they know enough to be able to ask those questions. They have language, they have concepts, they have these abstractions, they have theory of mind. They know about the idea that other people's knowledge is different from their knowledge, right? There's a whole series of concepts that they somehow magically already have. You know, the on switch has been pressed, and there's just a person that just pops into existence.
They decided to sit down and solve the problem once and for all. And to this end, they built themselves a stupendous supercomputer which was so amazingly intelligent that even before its databanks had been connected up, it had started from first principles with, "I think, therefore I am," and had got as far as deducing the existence of rice pudding and income tax before anyone managed to turn it off.
And we don't have an example of that actually happening in reality, of course, right? Humans don't do that. Even with AIs, so current artificial intelligence paradigms all require some kind of training to happen. You can't just magic an AI out of thin air. An AI needs to be trained. There's a process through which you take something that is basically just a bunch of random data and convert it into a functioning intelligence. You have to do that, otherwise all you have is a bunch of random data. You have a random number generator, in effect. This is what I think the mistake of a lot of the elder writers of AI went through. I'm thinking particularly of Asimov. As much as Asimov is, of course, the genius who almost defined the genre, his idea of the way we would create AI hasn't really stood up to current research. Asimov has this idea in his head where robots are basically like, I guess almost like mechanical watches. And you've got somebody in there like Dr. Calvin who is responsible for knowing all the intricacies of what goes on inside a robot's brain. And it's kind of like clockwork.
So, Dr. Calvin, what exactly do you do around here?
My general fields are advanced robotics and psychiatry, although I specialize in hardware to wetware interfaces in an effort to advance USR's robotic anthropomorphization program.
Somebody has to go in and specify every little thing the robot could possibly think and do and be. And you just don't do that with actual real-world AI. It's just too big a problem to solve. When we want to create image recognition algorithms, for example, we don't do that. We have a set of training data and we make the AI sit through the training data and make some guesses, tell it what it got wrong, adjust it so that it gets the next ones a bit more right, and repeat until it's got the desired level of accuracy. And that's a toy example compared to what we're talking about with human-like AI. But there would have to be some kind of training. And if you go through this process, isn't that part of the AI's experience? Isn't what we're talking about here really a kind of AI childhood? So the AI doesn't start when it's first switched on. It's already started before then. It has to have already acquired all the base knowledge of how to see the world, how to understand the world, even if it doesn't know basic facts. It doesn't need to know how to wash its hair, for example, but it needs to know how to ask questions. So that's one way that robots might come into existence. There's another school of thought, I guess, in science fiction about this, where instead of creating an AI from scratch, we transfer the consciousness of a human being into a machine.
He did what exactly?
Instead of creating an artificial intelligence, he duplicated an existing one.
Tell me you're joking.
He recorded the monkey's brain activity and uploaded its consciousness like a song or a
You're
movie.
out of your mind.
Will's body is dying, but his mind is a pattern of electrical signals that we can upload into pen. He can...
Ev, he's not a monkey.
I've seen this come up in a few different places, and often when this is talked about, it's not talked about in the sense of creating an AI or a robot, because I think we're a little bit nervous, maybe, about describing that uploaded entity as an artificial intelligence, because it's a human. And yet, it really is. But definitions aside, there are still some interesting issues to play with in our minds here. Philosophically, in order for this to make any sense, you have to convince yourself that what's going on up here, or what's going on in the totality of your existence, is really just data. You have to convince yourself that your consciousness is just data. If you can't convince yourself of that, then of course there's no way for you to upload your consciousness to a machine. It doesn't make any sense. There's no there cannot be a mechanism for doing that. But let's say we have convinced ourselves of that. We have convinced ourselves that the universe is sufficiently mechanistic that we can just transfer our essence to a machine in the form of data. This is also a bit tricky because your consciousness or your mind or whatever set of words you want to use to describe this, it's not just a data file that's sitting there waiting for you to copy it. Evolution didn't furnish us with a USB port in our necks, for example, and even if we had one, there's nothing there to copy. It's not data, it's just physical neurons and particles. So more questions arise, such as, do we have to reproduce the entirety of our nervous system and brain as a physical simulation of atoms and molecules? Or can we get away with some very, very small subset of that information that only concerns just the nerve cells and the synapses? In other words, what is it that we're actually copying here? How much of this is information that we need to preserve, and how much of it is just incidental physical details? So anyway, there's a few different ways we can think of creating a robot or an artificial intelligence that is human-like. Both of these approaches, I guess, impact the experience that a robot or an AI ultimately has. And so when we're writing this character, we can't really avoid making references to how they were created. This is a huge topic, and so I can't go into all of the different possible things that might happen in that character's life that could have led to the particular thoughts and actions they have as the story is taking place. But that's kind of the storyteller's prerogative. But it's certainly something that I'm really fascinated with, and I hope we do a lot more of it.